Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 6 of Monday Night Monsters. Very, very happy to have you guys on board with us tonight.
It's Monday again, my friend, and I'm excited about this show for a couple reasons. Number one is I've never spoken about this subject before in my rounds as a podcaster, so I'm looking forward to that. But the second reason I'm excited is this show was actually suggested by one of our listeners last week, and I
It
like
was
to get the
indeed.
listeners involved. So, like that, hey, we'll put on whatever these folks want to hear.
Absolutely. Once again, for those of you who might be new to the channel, I am Christopher Rondina. I am a legend hunter, a monster lover ever since I was a young whippersnapper, and I'm an author. Ron?
Exactly the same thing. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Folklorist, historian, writer. Like to pursue things that go bump in the night. I like to find out the origins of all these stories. I find that much more fascinating than a lot of the litany of sightings that go on. And that's what I like about you so much, Christopher, is that we delve deeply down that rabbit hole to find out at least a little bit of where these things originated.
Exactly. I think the truth is that mythology, folklore, legends, almost all of these have a kernel of truth to them. And while some of them may not have a supernatural component, and some of them may, at the core of almost all of them is something very tangible and very
Yep.
real. And it's fun to sort of peel back the sort of the layers of the sort of great onion of mystery behind some of these things, and and get to the heart of them and where they began.
It's
And
it's very visceral. Yeah, very visceral as well too. We talk about the idea of the collective unconscious, and we as humanity have all of these types of archetypes embroidered into our very DNA. And I think it's exciting to look at it from that perspective. So many people talk about going out there. The idea of boots on the ground, going out there looking for tracks and hooping and hollowing and knocking on trees. And that's all fine and dandy, and I've done that myself as well. But also, there's something to be said about scouring those recesses of the mind that very few people wonder.
All right. And by the way, Marianne, Jeff, welcome aboard. Glad to have you guys back as always. Marianne, I think that was your idea to do the Wendigo show, and we both thought that was a fantastic idea. So a fantastic suggestion, and thank you so much. So, of course, in case you missed it, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight. Is an extraordinary piece of indigenous Native American myth, the story and the legend of the Wendigo. But before we get too deep into this, I want to put in a disclaimer, and it is that, first of all, I certainly do not claim to be an expert in Native American spirituality, Native American culture. But the one thing that I know, and I think Ron, you'll agree with me on this, is that there's no simple way to boil down the various indigenous peoples of this country. They were very different groups, different nations, different languages, and there is no one size fits all in Native American belief. We're not here trying to appropriate anyone's culture or sort of define something that is outside of our experience. We just want to talk a little bit about the actual folklore connected with this, and do it in as sort of respectful of a way as possible.
I think that's the best way to do it, and that's a great disclaimer. As a matter of fact, we're kind of the Cliff Note version of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the way we go. I remember about 4 years ago, I was up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I was speaking to Ojibwa Nation up there whenever I was writing my book on the monsters of the Great Lakes. And this subject did indeed come up. And it's very fascinating to find out how varied it is. I mean, there are common elements to this, of course, but it's also varied from region to region. And there's no way that you and I could do this justice in 1 hour. There's just no, and nor are we, ethno-archaeologists of any kind either. But we can at least, kind of point out some of the similarities that is involved in this great creature known as the Wendigo.
Absolutely. And of course, the Ojibwe people are one of the many Algonquin speaking nations, and kind of under the great umbrella of the Algonquin, sort of the greater Algonquin native peoples. And this is where the origin of the Wendigo as we know it today does seem to come from. And I think often when people think of the Wendigo myth, they think of something from the Pacific Northwest, because we tend to think of these vast forests up there and it being very wild. And that would be reasonable. And the myth is not unknown to that area, but it actually began more here in eastern Canada, and actually right down through the East Coast. So right down through both our areas of the world. I'm in New England, you're down in Pennsylvania, and even these sections of the country had native peoples that believed in versions of this myth. But But without further ado, the Wendigo itself is an absolutely extraordinary a piece of myth. It's sort of a winter myth, and the Wendigo is a creature. It's basically a spirit that is the absolute personification of winter, of hunger, of need, and of greed. And in most versions of the myth, it's a fairly sinister being. It's sinister, or at the very least, a force of nature. And so the Wendigo, generally speaking, is considered to be an evil or a wicked creature. And I usually have a little quick intro here, and I'll read this for you. So the Wendigo is a spirit from Algonquin legend, which can possess a person who is weakened by hunger, by acts of selfishness and evil, and it personifies winter, starvation, greed, and cannibalism. One of the greatest taboos in in sort of the human experience. It is eternally hungry, never satisfied, no matter how much it devours. In fact, one of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of the Wendigo legend is the more it consumes, the more it grows, and it becomes emptier. So as it consumes, it actually becomes hungrier. It's really a terrifying thought, and sort of a very primal force.
Right. And because it encompasses so many of these dark, heinous things about the human nature, it's also that skeleton in our collective closets. It's something you keep away from it, but it's a part of really who we are as human beings. And we can look at these kind of myths, even as we will later, in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe. It is part of those cultures as well. It just goes by different names.
It is. And Jeff, actually, by the way, Jeff, that's a great question. How can anyone be an expert in creatures that have changed and evolved over the years? And the truth is that there is usually no one definitive myth. There may be a sort of an origin point to these myths, but they do evolve. And that's actually something we're going to talk about with the Wendigo story today, because the Wendigo myth has evolved dramatically over the course of the last 400 or 500 years, especially as European influence came into the New World. And that's something we're going to address directly this evening. So that's a great question.
Right. Yeah. Jeff also brought up a good point as well, too. I think the reason why we have this disclaimer is that so many of these shows blatantly put forth a bit of a culture of appropriation. They think that we can go in there and, we read a textbook and we understand exactly what these myths and legends meant to a people. And it's something that's intrinsically part of that culture. And we are on the outside looking in, and there's no way possible we can even come close to what this was part of their collective imagination at the time, or is even to this day. So we're not going to appropriate anything. We're simply going to take a gander in there and see what we can see.
Very much. So I'm going to throw up a map right now, just so people can see a little bit of an idea of not just how extensive the Algonquin-speaking peoples were, but if you look closely, I know this is a small map, but you can see some of the many, many different tribes. We have our own local Narragansett tribe that was here in Rhode Island, a native tribe. We had the Cree, the Ojibwe, and so many other tribes. And of course, these folks spanned an enormous space of land all across North America, had different traditions, different cultures, different spellings, not only in their language, but even Wendigo itself. The word has been spelled as Wendigo, Windigo, Witaka, and almost every one of them beginning with a W sound, the W sound in the Western alphabet. But fascinating that it had such commonality all throughout these many peoples. And so it is going to be difficult to cover all of that. We're really going to give a very sort of a small kind of a capsule version of what this myth is. But I think probably most of all, what the Wendigo is, it's a force of nature. It is a primal force, and depending on the mythology, there is a kind of an almost godlike Wendigo spirit. They say that when you're on a wintry night, when the wind is blowing and the ice is falling from the sky, and you hear the rattling of the trees, it's actually the sound of the Wendigo moving through the branches. When you hear the howling of the wind, it's the Wendigo screeching in hunger. And so it was an absolute primal force to these people, and that force, of course, as with any force, affects the human condition. And people affected by that sort of brutality of winter and starvation became ones who would become Wendigo, who become infected in a sense. And that's one of the interesting things about the Wendigo myth, is that it doesn't necessarily, at least the word, differentiate between the force itself, the spirit of the Wendigo, and then the possessed humans who sort of become Wendigo as well. They're one and the same.
Yes, whenever I was dealing with the Ojibwa, I actually asked because Shakespeare said, "What's in a name?" And whenever it comes to research, I always like to look at the origins of the name, and even the origins is a bit shady about where it comes from. But the closest that I could get, at least with the folks that I was able to interview, is the name simply refers to a monster. For quick translation terms, it's their idea of some sort of monster out there, and I think that that's an adequate term to use here as well too. Also, whenever we're dealing with winter, we think about it being an inconvenience and having to put snow tires on your car. But whenever you're dealing with a hunter-gatherer culture, this is one of those very trying times, isn't it? The people that you loved and the people that are part of your village, the chance that you're going to see them in the spring is not 100%. So this really does evoke all of those kind of terrors that these long winter nights kind of conjure. And also, the other thing about the Wendigo, whenever you're thinking about this and how it coincides with the winter season, so much of this is brought up in the wild hunt mythology, too, that we talked
Absolutely.
about several weeks ago. To stay in, to stay confined, to stay out of that world that belongs to the other. And I think that that's a very good totem, if you will, for those people that would venture out into the wild in the wintertime.
Absolutely, and as such, of course, and like the core of so many other myths, it became a cautionary tale.
Mhm.
It's the idea that, first of all, the fear of winter is crucial, because if you fear a deadly force, you're more likely to protect yourself against it. You're more likely to stock food for the winter if you don't believe that it's going to be an easy winter. You're more likely to repair the holes in your hut. You respond appropriately if you have a healthy fear of it. And so the idea of this monstrous force out there, basically the personification of winter itself, was a tale that taught you the wages of sin and the wages of inaction, and how to behave to protect yourself from that. And so again, it's a very, very primal thing, but also something that was instructive to people, and it takes on a supernatural form. I actually think one of the interesting things about the Wendigo in its human form is a human Wendigo, once a person has committed one of these crimes, the kind of crimes that would lead to becoming, that would be stealing from stealing from people in your tribe, or even from another tribe. If you stole food that would prevent them from getting through the winter, that's an act of evil. Choosing to abandon the elderly, and of course, acts of cannibalism. These kind of things were crimes that were detrimental to your tribe, and as a result, you would become possessed, and you would become this emaciated, almost skeletal, very feral creature, very animalistic. Things about the Wendigo that are fascinating is that, again, because it remains eternally hungry, no matter how much it eats, it is always emaciated. And they tended to become enormous because, as we mentioned earlier, they grow and they grow as they continue to eat. They could move like absolute like the wind. I think one of the reasons the name Wendigo is often so associated with wind is that it sounds like that. But they say that they could move as fast as the wind. They could become invisible. Wendigo could mimic the sound of a loved one and actually lure you away from your camp so that you would go out into the woods and be devoured by it. And in being so eternally hungry, this image is a great example of this. They would constantly chew at their own lips. And so the Wendigo traditionally had its lips in tatters and basically its bloody teeth exposed. So a truly horrific, monstrous, monstrous creature, and one that would very reasonably instill fear in people. And again, fear of making those deadly mistakes in the wintertime.
Right. In a pre-Judeo-Christian culture, without the idea of sin and without the idea of structured good and evil, these are not only crimes, but they are injustices against humanity. These are very inhumane things. Whenever you take from somebody or you do not provide for somebody, so I think that we see a very core of that kind of process as well too. And of course, I don't want to be the first one to say I think we got a demon here, but let me be the first one to say, this might be a demonic thing as well, too. That's of course coming from a culture that, as I said before, that is based upon Christian values and Judaic values. But whenever we're dealing with Aboriginal thoughts as well, too, the idea of the demon is also active in that as well. So if you could have an evil that's present within the aspects of nature, this is close to as the demonic as you're going to possibly get.
It's very, very true, and in fact, the Wendigo is a possessing spirit. I mean,
Mm,
the language, obviously wouldn't have been in the English language, but the basic term that they would use would that you would be possessed by the spirit of the
mm,
Wendigo, very much the way that Western culture would view something demonic, and
mm,
certainly Native cultures were not, they were not. Unfamiliar with the concept of spirits that would take over the body, and
mm,
so very much the way we would see demons in
mm,
in Western culture. In fact, one of the things about human culture in general is that there's always been a belief, and it seems to be common in virtually every culture globally, that corruption of the soul begins to manifest on the outside of the body, that a corrupt external body indicates a corrupt soul. Now, that might seem very judgmental because obviously there are people whose bodies are, deformed in some way, and they have often through history been labeled as demonically possessed or in some way corrupt. But even still, this thought is very, very common, or this concept is very, very common, that corrupted soul manifests externally and again can turn you into a literal monster, from a man into a monster.
mm,
Um, Now, in the throughout, I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly how far back the legend of the Wendigo goes in with the native people, but the first exposure we had to it with European culture was in the 1600s. In the 17th century, we had the very first Europeans coming over here, and a lot of people colonizing Canada, Nova Scotia, areas of North America, doing fur trapping and things like that. And it wasn't long before they encountered the native peoples, started trading with them, and began to absorb some of their legends. And the first Europeans who heard of the Wendigo myth actually found some familiarity with it. They while we didn't precisely, when I say we, I mean the European peoples didn't have the Wendigo. As soon as the story was brought to the European people, they instantly believed that they recognized it. And the first known reference to the story in European language was from a French document or series of documents called the Relations of the Jesuits. And in the early 1660s, there were dozens of volumes of these books dating back for about 80 years. But in the 1660s, one of them wrote about the Wendigo myth and how it had affected even their own people. And that's what's fascinating about it, is that they actually wrote about it affecting their own people. They said, oh, hang on, sorry, jumping in here. So this makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking for fresh prey. Now, they instantly believed that this myth was effectively the same myth as what the French would call the loup-garou, the werewolf. And what's interesting about that is that they didn't hesitate to adopt that belief into their world. And so the loup-garou and the Wendigo became intertwined. And actually, really, ever since then in Western culture, we've combined or associated these two ideas. But I want to quickly throw up the the earlier shot again, because down at the bottom it's much smaller. I didn't highlight it, but it says this ailment attacked our deputies, and as death is the sole remedy amongst these simple people, checking such acts required the killing of people. They actually believe that these people became so possessed of the Wendigo spirit, these were Europeans, that they had to be killed to stop them from killing. So it's extraordinary to think that this was something that seemed to be actually affecting living people in the real world, not a myth anymore, but something that the Jesuits were writing about as actual events.
right. And if I'm not mistaken, and I don't believe that I am, but I think the last person that was actually killed because they were believed to be a Wendigo was sometime in the late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. I think that I know that fact from somewhere, but that was something. I mean, you think about that. I mean, that is something that was so pervasive that somebody would actually take a life as late as that.
I know I actually did not know about that one. That's interesting. I'd love to get some details on that because that didn't come up in my research for this, but it is fascinating to think of. And it does make a lot of sense because through the 17th century into the 18th century, the belief among Europeans in people with magical abilities, including people who were believed to practice lycanthropy or the shapeshifting into werewolves. And of course, as with so many of the topics we cover, you notice that we cross over with other topics because myths just they don't fit into perfect little pockets. Myths frequently overlap, but werewolf trials, even the execution of people believed to be werewolf shapeshifters and witches and things like that, was so common among the European people. The idea that they would execute a person in the belief that they had become a Wendigo, which again the Europeans would recognize as a form of lycanthropy, doesn't sound terribly shocking at all. Now, there's a funny thing that I think is very common. It's become very common, certainly in the last few decades, and I don't know how far back it goes, which is portrayals of the Wendigo have almost universally begun to be of these sort of very feral, very savage-looking creatures with bone protrusions and even antlers. And it's a fascinating image because it has become so widespread. And what's interesting about it is that there doesn't seem to be a reason for this or an origin for this in the native myths. And there are people who have suggested that this particular portrayal of the Wendigo spirit, which again has become incredibly common in pop culture, actually traces back to a movie called The Wendigo that actually was only made about 20 years ago, that portrayed a Wendigo spirit almost entirely constructed of the bones of deer with antlers. But there's actually probably some reason that this might have been a sort of a visual image that would become common with Europeans or popular with Europeans. And I think that we would have associated, among other things, the Wendigo myth with the kind of wild man myth. There's something that's been very, very common throughout European culture. We talked a little bit about it when we were talking about Celtic myths a while ago, is these sort of horned savage beings, these almost pagan-like images of people who are part man and part animal. And this wild man myth is something that's a really huge part of human culture and that Europeans, again, almost immediately would have gravitated towards. And so if they were imagining these bestial, savage creatures, to see them as part man and part horned animal would have been culturally really, I think, pretty commonplace.
Well, absolutely. And also think about it this way. They drew upon those pagan roots, these horned gods, these wild men, to portray what we now imagine as the devil, right? Something that's
Yes.
horned, cloven feet. It is very natural to think about how these myths that have now kind of interlocked over each other, right? So now we do see cultures coming in, and whenever you have these two impacts, what comes out of it?
The thing about the wild man myth too is that it almost always coincides with very much of the same thing that we're talking about with the Wendigo myth. They're people who have sort of lost their humanity, returned to nature. They were frequently considered to be flesh eaters, cannibalistic, and often considered to be men. And it's interesting, by the way, when we say men, we are referring most often to just humanity in general. I'm not trying to be sexist or anything, but in most of these old legends, because of the way genders were seen at different times, I think we discussed this at one point during the werewolf program, is that the genders were seen as having different magical paths, and the savagery and the animalistic nature tended to be associated with men. And so most often these are actually legends about male creatures, although curiously enough, it's said that when a person is possessed by a Wendigo spirit and actually becomes Wendigo, they lose all gender. They become a genderless creature. But these wild men myths definitely, again, refer to men who had fallen from grace, lost their morality, become savage, become flesh eaters, and ran off and lived in the woods. And again, this was a completely analogous to the Wendigo myths, and so easily absorbed by the European people. And there's other analogs in native belief to these creatures as well. I think you had mentioned something when we were first talking about doing this program about skinwalkers. Skinwalkers, again, a native shape-shifting legend. These are supposed to be witches, effectively. Well, witch being, of course, the European term for how we would understand it, but magical shamanic beings, almost always malicious, malevolent, who would wear animal skins and take on the abilities of animals, even completely transform into animals in order to do wickedness. So once again, we're flashing back to some of our earlier topics, but the idea of shamanic skinwalking and transforming and even consuming children and people was something that was actually very common in some of the darker Native American myths across the nation.
Yeah. And one of the attributes of the skinwalker now, because people do report encounters with these creatures. The Skinwalker Ranch was a very popular program on television there for a while. But one of the attributes associated with the modern encounters of skinwalkers is their ability to mimic voices, as we had talked about earlier, as you had mentioned earlier. So to hear a woman crying or a baby crying or somebody just hollering out a greeting, that is often heard as a way to lure a victim off the trail into the domain of the Wendigo or the shapeshifter.
That actually even coincides with what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with the Celtic mythology. That frequently these spirits, these goblins and boogeymen from Celtic mythology also had the ability to lure people, and usually by either taking on the form of somebody attractive or somebody that they knew or a child, and using these sing-songy voices to lure them to the woods. So again, we see this commonality, and that seems to have evolved entirely independently. Or at the very least goes back to the sort of communal memory. So that's something that again, the Europeans, when they were colonizing the area, had no difficulty adopting. Jeff, you said that I noticed that many native stories are stretched by pioneers to give them more of a relatable form. I think that honestly, while that's true, I think that the reason that they stretched and elaborated on these stories wasn't even necessarily to make them more relatable, was to make them more terrifying. When you're trying to other someone, when you're trying to make someone seem like the enemy, you want to vilify them, demonize them. There's demon again, as much as you can. And I think that was something that unfortunately we all know happened when the European settlers came here. We would trade with the natives. We would sometimes live side by side, but when push came to shove, we would make them the other. We would make them the enemy. And by making them sound like savages, that was our favorite word to describe them, and talking about their terrible spirits and the terrible things they believed, we were able to make them seem more foreign and more animalistic. And it justified for many of the early settlers, it justified either driving them from their homes or eradicating them. So it's a dreadful bit of sort of sin from our own past.
Well, sure, it's an insight onto American culture, isn't it? And for those people that really want to see this driven home, all you have to do is read the fourth paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and it really kind of changes your mind. This was the common thought at that time. The word that you used was savage, and that's absolutely correct. And there is definitely, whenever any culture comes in contact with another culture, and there's at least a kernel of sense, or at least there is some sort of parable to be shown out of their particular myths, of course we're going to adopt them and adapt to them. But what is so fascinating is, like you had said, it does indeed seem to have evolved separately on different continents over a vast time period. Now, I do have one question for you. I will posit this for: is it possible in your imagination that some of these myths could have come from Viking encounters, at least in the far eastern side of Canada, and possibly spread? Because if the Inuit people started to have contact with the Vikings, possibly as early as 1000 AD, and they were able to bring all these ideas, they brought a vernacular with them concerning shapeshifters and berserkers and of course the horned gods and everything. Even though this was they were Christian at this time, they would have definitely have had pagan beliefs and throwovers and things like that, especially whenever it comes to dealing with the natural world. Is it possible in your mind that some of these things could have bridged over from contact with Vikings?
I actually think it's entirely possible. It's, I mean, it's not an area that I'm deeply versed in, but it's a speculation that has been made before. I believe that that some speculation was made. Speculative fiction certainly is covered. There was a film called Pathfinder, which I believe
Mhm.
actually addressed that idea, as well as I think Michael Crichton's book Eaters of the Dead talked about the way that the berserker myths may have been influenced in a similar way. And we of course we did speak about berserkers and when we did our werewolf program, our very first show. And so the idea that these animal cloaked savage people invading the land of of the natives, especially Vinland, which we believe may well have been a reference to the continental of North America. It's entirely possible, I think.
Mhm.
So I guess what we'd need to know in a case like that to really make a determination is, could we trace the Wendigo legend back before the times that the first Viking raiders actually reached these shores, presuming they did, and it certainly seems very strongly evident that they did at this point, or does it go back farther than that, and they simply used it to sort of enrich their stories about the Vikings? They may have believed that the Vikings represented part of this Wendigo idea, or were
Absolutely.
in fact Wendigo themselves. And that's the thing too, is
Yeah.
that I think like most cultures, just because someone came from a different place wouldn't mean that they couldn't exemplify the native myth. And so, would they have believed that these Vikings were Wendigo, were these sort of possessed, savage, flesh-eating monsters? I think almost certainly that would be a good part of them. I wanted to quickly address Mary Beth had put up a question a few minutes ago, saying that in your past, when you'd heard the stories of the Wendigo, you'd heard it connected to the wood and the trees, but never with bones or anything like that. And definitely it is true that, again, we don't really see, I think, in early native culture, the idea of a creature created from bones or with antlers or anything like that. However, the descriptions are of them being so emaciated they're virtually skeletal. And certainly that idea, when people pick up on ideas, sometimes they seize on particular concepts and run with it. And I think between that, the European idea or identification with the wild men with being horned creatures, and even the idea that antlers and stags and things like that being prey animals, and certainly in a way representing a form of hunger. I mean, they were one of the primary prey animals of north-dwelling people, and so they would have had an association with, the idea of a spirit in the form of a stag or a deer or a caribou that became a predator instead of prey. Would have been sort of that ironic, sort of turning of the tables. So it's possible that that's where it came from. But I also don't discount the idea that it's a fairly modern invention. It certainly has caught fire. I mean, it's a very, very big part of how the Wendigo is seen today. And like most myths, they do evolve. And so I don't know that we'll ever divest the Wendigo of this antlered concept. It's certainly a very striking image.
And the idea of it being bones as well too. The personification of death itself. When we think about the Grim Reaper, we always think about this cloaked figure with a skeletal face. So it's the bringer of death as well too. I mean, it is something that is part of who we are. Whenever we see a skeleton, we automatically assume that it has something to do with the other, the other realm, and it's coming into our world. And what else? As you had said at the very onset, these creatures never are benign creatures. There's always a malignancy to them. And I think that is one of the reasons why, is because it has so much tie-in with death itself.
It is, and it's interesting because the death connection and the evil is it's a banal evil. It's an evil of sort of the cruelty of nature rather than a specific malevolence. It's not necessarily that the Wendigo seeks to do evil. It's simply seeking to sate its hunger,
Mm.
and so it is again a personification of a force of nature. But nature is cruel. Nature is heartless. Nature doesn't, differentiate between the young and the old. When it claims somebody, nature doesn't seem to have mercy. And because of that, nature has often been seen as evil. But what's, I think, intriguing about that is that we don't imagine native indigenous cultures seeing that. We tend to imagine, and there is certainly a large degree of truth to this, that native cultures lived much closer to the land and had a very magical belief system. And so we tend to imagine, I think, in this new age, popular new age ideas, that it was all sweetness and light, that everything was good and all parts of nature were equally, lovely, and they were in harmony with them. But of course, like anyone else, natives didn't want to starve to death in the winter. They didn't want to fall off a cliff or be gored by a caribou on a hunt. They saw that there was bad in nature, and they were able to personify that too. So nature, even to the Native Americans, was not all goodness. They had their evil entities, the skinwalkers and the trickster spirits that could lure you to your death. And there was definitely a dark side to Native mythology as well.
Yeah, and the other thing is, getting back to the idea of the werewolf, even the person, that says their prayers by night can still come under the influence of this, right? I mean, even a person that's good of heart can still be possessed by these creatures and become something that they never dreamt that they were ever going to be. It's not like they pursued it, they become it.
Yeah, and again, it's the idea that it is a possession. It's an outside force. Obviously, you want to believe that the person is good at heart, but that anything. I think that, again, there's your cautionary tale right there. Is the idea that even a good person, just as said in the old poem from the Wolfman, even a good person can be possessed by this evil force, can be overcome by the desires of hunger and rage and greed, and take on these evil things. And I think it makes us feel better about our own humanity to believe that that's an external force, that it's not something that's built into us. And so I think that's one of the reasons that so many of our legends concern, when we were talking about the changelings a couple of weeks ago in Celtic mythology or the werewolves or anything else, the idea that we are inherently good and that some evil force has to come from outside of us to make us do bad things, when in truth, we are very fickle creatures, and we can turn on a dime. We have the capacity for good and evil in us every bit as much. And so, but those myths help us. I think they help us process those things and feel like at the end of the day, we are worthwhile creatures.
Right. And the idea about cannibalism as well, too. The idea that we can be so, at such a dire strait to turn to eat our own. It's better in our minds to suggest that something overcame us or possessed us, rather than think that we could just simply go there out of need for sustenance.
Sorry, I'm quickly reading a couple of comments to see if we had any questions I wanted to get to. I wanted to point out here that my friend John was on, and he was talking about something that, John, we're going to get to the subject of Athaqua in just a moment. So if you just have a little patience, I don't want to jump the gun on that one, but it's a great reference there. And let's see. I'm sorry again. I have ADD, folks. So when I'm reading the question, sometimes I can lose track of where I am here. But so Mary Beth was saying that she enjoys arguments against reanimating the dead in the game I play. Now you got to tell me what game this is, because of course I'm an abject gamer myself. But yes. The idea of cannibalism is it is one of the greatest taboos in human, in sort of human culture globally. And the idea that this particular taboo was considered to be so sacred, even among the native peoples, that they wanted you to know that if you resorted to that you would be irreversibly tainted by evil. And that's something that does pop up not only in the Wendigo myth, but it is very, very prominent in the werewolf myth as well. And in fact, in many cases, the werewolf stories, and very probably the Wendigo stories, may have arisen from cases where a person under desperate circumstances actually did turn to cannibalism. Obviously, we want to believe that nobody turns to cannibalism willingly, but there were certainly times, I'm sure, that people, even in native cultures, there had to be people who were emotionally disturbed and may have committed these acts without the need to do it. But certainly also, again, the reason that these creatures are considered creatures of winter and ice and snow and desperation is because these were the times when people would be forced sometimes to take these desperate measures. And they're not alone in human culture. There are analogs in cultures all over the world. The Tibetan Yeti and then the Siberian Chuchuna, both very, very similar creatures. The Yeti a little bit more associated with maybe with what we would consider our North American Bigfoot myths, but still the idea of this savage wild creature. We think of them today, I think, as ape-like, but they are supposed to be cannibalistic or at least flesh-eating, wandering the snowy mountains. Again, very much a creature of ice and snow and remote locations. And the Chuchuna is an interesting one from Siberian myth because it is a hugely, exaggeratedly large man who wears animal pelts, but is still actually seen to be human, and again will capture or lure people from unsuspecting villages who wander into the woods and consume them whole. So these are very, very similar to the idea, although maybe a little bit more mortal, a little bit more corporeal than the Wendigo myth, because they don't necessarily involve spirits. But it's not uncommon to find these myths in different places all over the world. Now, I'm sure that there are countries farther out into Asia that have very, very similar myths to these as well.
Yeah, the thing about Yeti is that we so often look at it as just a cut and dry Bigfoot, but in that particular culture, these are indeed spiritual animals that, or spiritual beings, I should say, that straddle the line between reality and the other side. They're kind of like a shaman in of their own way because they can communicate with both sides, and a lot of times, in Tibetan religions, the monks will look to them as guidance in a way. But the Yeti, for thousands of years, I'm sure, part of their oral tradition up until very recent times, until the Western world took over. They were seen as capable of disappearing and reappearing at will, to assume other shapes. There's also that shape-shifting attribute to the Yeti as well. So, I mean, in that particular culture, yes, indeed, they do take the place of the Wendigo that we see here in North America.
Now, despite the fact that European settlers did come here, did encounter the Wendigo myth, actually incorporated it in many ways into their own beliefs, into, like, again, the Loup-garou beliefs, which were not only common, obviously, in Ontario and Quebec and places like that, but made it down here into continental U.S. You still have the legends of the Loup-garou among the French people, the Cajun people down in New Orleans and things like that. And so, despite this fact, the Wendigo itself, I don't think ever really lodged much of a footing in Western culture until the early 20th century, and this was not as a result of folklore, but as a result of fiction. Two important works of fiction appeared in the early 20th century. In 1910, Algernon Blackwood wrote a story simply called "The Wendigo," and based, or at least heavily inspired by his version of the Wendigo, August Derleth, who was a kind of an acolyte of H.P. Lovecraft, wrote "The Thing That Walked on the Wind" in 1933. And that's a story that's really intriguing because The Thing That Walked on the Wind references a sort of a Wendigo god. And this god is called Ithaqua. And in a sense, the Wendigo god is meant to be the sort of the core spirit, the originator of the possessive Wendigo force. And so he would have acolytes, and those acolytes would become living Wendigo, much as the way we see them in folklore. Now, this is an entirely fictional creation, but it's a fictional creation that is woven out of real myth and real folklore. And these stories were incredibly, they were well received, they were very popular, and they helped to popularize the idea of the Wendigo to modern audiences. And slowly but surely, we began to see it pop up in culture. But as I say, this Wendigo god, the Windwalker Ithaqua, was seen as this massively huge, just as Wendigo, who was very ancient, I suppose, would become, massively huge, non-corporeal, spirit-like creature that was present in the wind, present in the snow. And now that's an idea that is genuinely terrifying. Basically, an evil god of ice and wind that would turn its acolytes into cannibals. And that idea was very, very popular, entered into contemporary culture. And I think it's a lot of the way that we here in the Western world became, well, I say the Western world as if the indigenous people weren't part of it, but rather the European colonized world really became familiar with the Wendigo myth. And it has since then woven its way through our, not only through our fiction and through popular culture, but it's actually started to turn up in film. And there have been some extraordinary films made about the Wendigo myth, and that's something I think it'll be a little bit fun to explore going into the next few minutes. Now, I would have to imagine that you must know the film Ravenous.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes.
Ravenous is an extraordinary movie made in 1999. Has a fantastic cast. Guy Pearce, certainly one of my favorite actors in this. But this is a movie that is interesting because it treads the line between sort of a serial killer film and a supernatural film. And it's actually inspired not only in part by Wendigo mythology, but also inspired in large part by a real event, which I'm sure some of you out there are familiar with, the Donner Expedition. The Donner Party were a group of settlers who in the 1840s left from Missouri on their way to California, but they made some terrible miscalculations. They decided to take an alternate route that was an untried route. They ran into truly brutal winter conditions and ended up trapped in, I believe it was in Nevada eventually. After several months, the trip should have taken 6 months. It ended up taking over a year for the few survivors to get there. But those who became trapped in the mountains in this terrible, terrible blizzard began to die one by one, and are very, very well known for having been forced into cannibalism in order to survive. And so it's a dreadful story, but a very true one, and one of the ones that helped to influence this film, Ravenous. If you have not seen Ravenous, I do highly recommend it. Please be aware, it is a film that is very violent and often disturbing to watch, but it directly explores the Wendigo myth as it infects a group of American soldiers at a base, which I believe is supposed to be in the Midwest somewhere. I apologize that I can't remember off the top of my head where they're supposed to be located, but in a fairly snowy section of the northern Midwest at a remote encampment, and all basically end up being overtaken by this Wendigo affliction. And it's a genuinely startling and terrifying film. It's a really interesting way that explores how the Wendigo myth impacted European culture.
It's intelligently done without the jump scares. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Robert Carlyle, one of my favorite actors, a very underrated actor as well too. A great Scottish actor. You probably know him from Train Spotting. But yeah, it's a really remarkable movie. And I think to get to the actual, the truth of what the Wendigo legend suggests is indeed this fantastic film called Ravenous.
The another film that has been a big favorite of mine. Now, of course, we are both big werewolf fans, and I suppose that some of you folks out there must love werewolves too. And so, werewolf fans like us, we hunt down every movie that's ever made about werewolves. That's just the nature of the beast, if you'll pardon the pun. And there's a great series of films that came out probably starting about maybe 15 years ago or so called Ginger Snaps. And the Ginger Snaps series of films were always incredibly creative. They focused on a female werewolf, and it was a fascinating story that actually initially in its first run equated the idea of werewolfism or lycanthropy to the menstrual cycle and the change that a woman goes through. But it was written by a woman and directed by a woman, and therefore it wasn't some grim male perspective on this, but rather a fascinating examination of the difficulties that women go through when they reach sexual maturity and what men put them through. So it was a film that had a really good edge to it, had a fantastic cast, was popular enough that it spawned a couple of sequels. But the third film in the series decided to do something kind of interesting. They called it Ginger Snaps Back, which is a clever title, and it went back to the 1800s, the mid 19th century, and it focused on a trading post in the Canadian wilderness. And these two young women show up one day, somehow having made their way safely through the woods, only to find that about half of the camp is empty because their trading expedition that they would send out every spring never made it back. And it turns out that they were overtaken by the Wendigo sickness and have all basically become werewolves. And this is one of the films that beautifully blends the idea of the Wendigo myth, native belief, and the werewolf myth. And it's a fascinating film. It's well made, a film that's made on a very small budget but manages to look excellent. And so once again, this is one that if you are fascinated by the Wendigo myth, werewolf mythology, it's one that I would highly recommend. I'm a huge fan of period horror films set in the 18th and 19th century. Absolutely my personal favorite, but one that I don't think that anyone should miss. Again, what the Wendigo has begun to really, it's begun to really solidify its place, I think, in Western American culture, and that's fascinating for a movie that, for a legend that traces itself back to Native American belief systems. But Wendigo, we spoke about early on, 1999. This is one of the ones that probably established the concept of the Wendigo as having antlers or even being sort of created of bone. A very recent film that's gotten some buzz, simply called Antlers. This is a movie that I have to say, if you have a chance to see Antlers, this is another one that it's a little disturbing. It's got some very, very dark imagery and dark ideas, but really clever because it draws on exactly that concept of hunger, of need, of poverty. And it's actually set in a little town in Oregon that is clearly economically depressed. People there, barely making it by. And the idea of, again, the Wendigo contagion sort of making its way into these people who have this sort of eternal hunger and need. And so, again, one that I would highly recommend if anyone, if anyone is a film buff and doesn't mind a little bit of gore, a little bit of disturbing imagery. But then again, that's the nature of horror. And if you're here, I imagine that you're probably a fan of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Monday Night Monsters. I want to get back to Ginger Snaps back.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, one of my favorite werewolf movies. But what's so cool about this movie as well, too, is that you do see that Native American influence in there as well. There is a witch in there. So the idea that there's cultures clashing is very intrinsic in this movie as well, too. It's an integral part of this movie as well. So yeah, I do recommend that, not only from a Wendigo point of view or a werewolf point of view, but it's a really effective film.
It really is. And it's nice sometimes. I love independent films, independent films that are actually intelligently written, have a little bit of real depth to them. That's a personal favorite of mine. And of course, again, if you set something in the 19th century, the 18th century, you pretty much can write your own check for me. That's my favorite era to see. I love historical horror in general. And that's one I would highly recommend.
Yeah, the two girls that play in that, the two leads, do you remember their names off?
Oh gosh, Catherine Isabel. Catherine Isabel is the redhead. Right. I cannot remember, unfortunately, the name of the dark-haired girl, but these are two fantastic actresses who've both done a lot of great work over the years. Actually, both had a lot of success in the horror film industry. In fact, the younger sister, whose name is Brigitte in the movie, was actually played the young Bev in the original TV film of It. So if you remember anything about the original TV film of It, now we're just getting into nerd talk here. But
no, but there was if you have kids at home, which I do, there was a Nickelodeon program on. It was an update of Cinderella, and they actually cast the two girls from Ginger Snaps as the wicked stepsisters in that movie.
Great.
It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, and only the nerds would understand that. So it was very well done as well too.
So there's one other aspect about the Wendigo that I think is worth pointing out. Now we, us sort of Westerners, us European descended people, we've sort of crystallized the idea of what we believe the Wendigo is. This bestial creature. It bears vague resemblance to the original native myth. But the thing about the actual native myth is that it, like most myths, has continued to evolve. And because the Wendigo itself was always a creature of hunger and corruption and sin, it has also evolved to be something different than it was. Because today there's still a great deal of people in the various indigenous communities across the country who still hold on to a lot of their old beliefs, but like us today, they're not necessarily worried about, being snowed in for the winter or anything like that. They live by modern technology. And so the Wendigo myth has evolved to be a part of modern ideas. And just as we were discussing the idea that when the Viking warriors came, that they applied the Wendigo myth to them, they certainly probably couldn't have avoided applying it to the Western colonizers as well, because you have to imagine that what were we when we first arrived in this country other than ravenous, consuming monsters that came in, took their land away, cut down all the trees, and burned everything in sight. And to them, that must have been the very heart of the Wendigo idea. So in many ways, I think we became the monsters of Native American mythology at that time. And to this day, we continue to tear down trees, to burn rainforests, and we've never really given up on this. In fact, I think that really one of the most poisonous aspects of modern Western culture, and obviously this is true worldwide, but we're of Western culture, is even in politics. The politics, of course, of greed have become such a huge part of the way we see the world. And so you would imagine that when today we have native cultures who are still fighting to get back their own land, still fighting to have sovereignty on the land that they have, who have to fight back against, pipelines and projects that cut through their sacred land, that our government, we have become the devouring beast. We have become the Wendigo in many ways. And so it's a terrifying thought. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit woke today, but that's my nature. I feel like the Wendigo has proven itself to be alive and well, and it's us.
Mm. And that's usually the case, isn't it? So whenever we've started this program, what is this? Do you say this is our 6th episode?
This is our 6th episode.
Wow. Yeah, I always like to point out, because I'm a huge fan of Carl Jung, and he suggests in his teachings that within every human being, there is this dark place that lurks, this shadow. And if you can get deep enough down into that shadow, you'll discover that there's a mirror in there. And in that mirror, we see our reflection. And that is a great way to put that there, Christopher. So it's a shame that when we uncover these kind of myths around the world, whether it's a Frankenstein myth or a werewolf or a Wendigo, at the end of the day, we have that Scooby-Doo moment when we remove that mask, and lo and behold, it is a human being that's underneath that mask. But that is a reason why this program to me is so fascinating. And even if nobody was listening to this, I would still want to meet with you every Monday to talk about this, because it really is so fascinating to show how the commonality in the human race, and the idea of myth making, and the idea of monster making, why it's essential for us to have these things in there. Now, of course, all that being said, I still view myself as a cryptozoologist. I still go out into the woods. I still, interview people that tell me stories about having encounters with these kind of creatures. And I'm not taking anything away from them. But as we wrap the show up tonight, I think it's a very pertinent point to point out that at the end of the day, the majority of these creatures are indeed humans.
And very much so. And it's an excellent point. The thing is that we need our monsters, because our monsters are a mirror, and they show us our darkest parts. And I think that they teach us important things about ourselves. And so whether it's, the Wendigo, werewolves, the sprites and the fairies that we believe, sort of live in the earth, these are the creatures that sort of reflect back at us our darkest instincts. And I'm like you. I absolutely, believe that there is something out there beyond our normal ken. I believe I've had experiences with ghostly beings. I believe that there are things out there we haven't discovered yet. But just because there are things out there that we don't know doesn't mean that every one of these myths is a literal supernatural event. Sometimes it's just an incredibly powerful lesson, a life lesson. Basically, the Little Red Riding Hood story that teaches us about wandering off the path and encountering wolves. And so I think these stories will always be a big part of who we are.
I think so as well, too. So before we wrap it up this evening, my friend, I think that we should throw it out there. Now, you're not going away yet, right? You have another couple of weeks with us.
About I think 3 weeks or 2 weeks from now, I will be heading out for England. So we may be doing a little bit of a different style show that night.
Great. So I would suggest that, because this show was so utterly engaging tonight, and it really allowed me to do a lot of research into a subject that I wasn't all that familiar with. But I would love in the next minute or so to kind of throw it out there and see if there's any suggestions for next week's program, unless you already have one set.
You know what? I don't. And I think it was fantastic to get a suggestion from the audience last week. And so if anybody wants to, even if you want to comment at a later point on our YouTube, to show us, we would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, because there's a lot of great monsters out there, and we don't always think of all of them. And so, of course, we're always willing to hear. And so we will probably take a look through those comments and maybe come up with a good idea for what our show is going to be next week. So, yes, ladies and gentlemen, as we move towards wrapping up, I just do want to remind you, if you guys are having fun with this, please don't hesitate to subscribe, hit the like button, and even you can hit the notification bell, and make sure that you get alerted when we're doing these new shows. That helps us a lot. These subscribers help us to get the word out there. You can share this show with other people. We love that. And again, as always, you can look us up on Facebook. You can look us up on social media. If anybody's interested in picking up any of my books on folklore or anything like that, I am at ghostboypress.com. I'm going to throw that up on the screen for a moment. Always happy to see new visitors there. But folks, we love you guys. We're glad you keep coming back every week and listening to us ramble on about all the monsters out there. And we look forward to seeing you next Monday on Monday Night Monsters.
That's right. We'll see you later, folks.
All right. Good night, guys.